Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant, and today I have a doozy for you. Most of this is going to be audio only, a podcast if you will, because I want you to be able to listen to it as often as you want to. Listen to it at work, listen to it in your car, whatever works for you. Get a converter online to convert MP4 into MP3. Do what you have to do to listen to this at least once. Because I'm going to give you a history of the United States of America. Obviously, it's not a complete history. As I went through this, there were abundant events that I had to omit. I chose the events in here to create a timeline to show you the progression of the nation, the United States of America. To show you a progression that if you think about it, you will have a better understanding of what just happened when the United States of America came to an end a few weeks ago. So please don't think there's any political agenda or social agenda to me leaving out things about certain topics here and there. It's just, come on, there's 10,000 relevant topics I could talk about. I had to pick and choose, but there's a lot of them here. And as you hear them, as you hear me talk about them in order with the dates and the years, if you think about it, you're going to see the direction that this country went from its founding. And you'll start to see why we ended up where we are today, which is the very beginning of a brand new totalitarian society. I'm going to do my very best to not comment on the things in this list. I will comment on some of them, just a warning. But I'm going to do my best not to comment. And it's hard for me because I want you to know why I'm putting them in here. But let me give you a few examples. For example, when I talk about Carl Sagan's Cosmos series being on PBS in 1980, I'm just going to tell you that. But if you look at my Junk Science series, which has 8 videos in that series, you're going to understand why broadcast of the Cosmos series was very significant in the way that the United States of America ended up. Likewise, something that seems as benign as Pluto's demotion from a planet status to something other than a planet may not seem significant, but if you listen to my Junk Science video again, in that case, you're going to realize that was meant to serve junk science, and junk science is one of the biggest threats we've had in the United States in the last 100 years. It's one of the reasons we are where we are today. As you listen to this list through the progression, I want you to think carefully about the progression of politics, technology, people's thoughts and attitudes, their sense of patriotism, the general morality of the nation, and our priorities. Think about this list of events in American history in that context. Politics, technology, our thoughts and attitude, the morality of the nation, patriotism, and adherence to the U.S. Constitution. If you don't adhere to the law, by definition, it's a lawless society. And that's what happens. And our priorities. What were our priorities? Is it having a good life and protecting our family? Or is it a bunch of political, social, ideological nonsense that wasting our time on all of that destroyed everything that otherwise would have made our lives wonderful? I hope having that iPhone was worth it, folks. The good news is totalitarian societies will allow you to keep the phone because it serves their purposes. Let's get started with the list, shall we? Okay, we're going to start in the year 1706, January 17th. That is the day Benjamin Franklin was born. 1706. Benjamin Franklin born. He became a statesman, a printer, a politician, an inventor, and the first postmaster general. 1732, George Washington is born. Also in 1732, Ben Franklin publishes his Poor Richard's Almanac, which continued until 1758. 3 years later, in 1735, John Adams was born. About 8 years later, in 1743, Thomas Jefferson was born. 2 years later, in 1745, John Jay was born. And 10 years later, in 1755, Alexander Hamilton was born. Not quite 20 years later, in 1776, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, in which, quote, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor," unquote. These people put their lives, everything that they owned, their families' futures, in fact the future of their very bloodlines at risk to give us the freedom that we just gave up. Also in 1776, the Articles of Confederation were drafted. It wasn't until 1781 that the Articles of Confederation were ratified, however. The American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, that occurred from 1775 through 1783. And at the time after the Revolutionary War ended, when the Articles of Confederation just were not working out, they did not have enough power, and they had no way for the federal government to get any money, they changed it and they came up with the U.S. Constitution, which was signed in 1887. It was ratified in 1788. When the U.S. Constitution was created, the story goes, somebody asked Ben Franklin, "What is it, Mr. Franklin, a monarchy or a republic?" And Ben Franklin answered, "It's a republic, if you can keep it." Up until the year 2021, our generation, all of our ancestors kept it. Our generation did not. In the year 1789, the U.S. Constitution became effective, and George Washington was sworn in as the first U.S. president. In 1797, John Adams became the second president. In 1799, George Washington died from medical malpractice. His doctors bled him to death. Doctors. In the year 1801, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States. 2 years later, he oversaw the Louisiana Purchase, which pretty much doubled the size of the United States of America. It gave us an additional 828,000 square miles for $15 million. That's $18 per square mile. It gave us parts of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. It gave us some or all of that territory. It also gave us a Gulf port in Louisiana, where the Mississippi River exits into the Gulf. Very, very strategically important for a new country. In the year 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born to poverty in a log cabin in Kentucky. He eventually became a self-educated lawyer, and as you know, he also became the President of the United States, all without any government-sponsored public education. How about that? In the year 1818, the Farmer's Almanac began publication, and I believe it's still publishing today, although it ain't what it once was. In the year 1826, on July 4th, this was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson died. A few hours later, on that same day, July 4, 50-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, President John Adams died. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson lives." You see, back then they didn't have instant communications between people, so he didn't know that Jefferson had just died a few hours earlier. Both of those great men died on the 4th of July, 50 years after the Declaration was signed. If you don't see the hand of God in something like that, then you have more faith in coincidences than anyone I've ever seen have faith in a God. By the way, on that day when those two presidents died, Abraham Lincoln was 17 years old, and he left his home for the first time to go and work on a ferry. In the year 1840, Nancy Pelosi was born. Oh, wait. Sorry, that's 1940. She just looks like she was born in 1840. 1844, the telegraph, using Morse code, connected Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Understand what this means. The very first time there was almost instant communication at such a huge distance in human history. 1845, Edgar Allan Poe published his poem, The Raven. 4 years later, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe dies. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed by a Democrat Congress. It criminalized anybody who helped slaves escape. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm just going to repeat it. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed by Democrats, which criminalized the act of helping black slaves escape human slavery. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was published. In 1859, and I should mention, I'm going to point out a couple things that happened in other countries because they're very relevant to the United States. So here's one of them. In 1859, a book was published by Charles Darwin. Most people call it On the Origin of Species, but I'd like to give you the full title, like I did in my junk science videos. The full title of it was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. By means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. 1860, the Pony Express began deliveries between Missouri and California. I think it only went on for about a year, but it was pretty significant. Again, communication is essential. If you can't communicate with other people, you can't get anything done. For example, if they had had censorship so that the Pony Express could not ride, those people could not communicate and they could get nothing done. Just something to think about. The year 1861, on March 4th, Abraham Lincoln, that self-educated man who didn't need the government for his education, became the President of the United States. Almost immediately, the American Civil War broke out. The American Civil War went from 1861 to 1865. Around 700,000 Americans died in combat, and an unknown number of civilians died. Also, in 1861, the telegraph using Morse code connected the east and the west coast. Remember, before it connected Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Now, transmitting through the telegraph, maybe not quite instantly, but very, very quickly, California could communicate with the East Coast. The importance of that cannot be understated. 1862, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Let me rephrase that. Republican President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves and essentially defying the Democrats' Fugitive Slave Act, which would put people in prison for doing what Abraham Lincoln did to free the slaves. 1863, construction begins on the first intercontinental railroad from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. Also in 1863, in July, the Battle of Gettysburg, which most people would call the turning point of the Civil War, the last time the Confederacy really had a victory. 2 years later, in 1865, on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at the Ford's Theater. Let me repeat that date one more time. When Abraham Lincoln, the man who fought against the idea of a national bank, who fought against the idea of other countries taking over our country economically during the Civil War, he was assassinated on April 15th, which today is tax day. 4 years later, 1869, the Golden Spike was pounded into the ground and it completed the first transcontinental railroad. That meant that human beings could travel in a very short order, at least from Nebraska to California. In 1874, and I believe this happened in either France or the UK, but it's important. 1874, heroin was invented by an academic, quote, scientist. Thank you for that gift, sir. 1876, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain is published, and Mark Twain becomes the definition of a national celebrity. Only he was the real deal, not manufactured. He was a real celebrity. Also in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell was issued a patent for the telephone. That was 1876. 1 year later, in 1877, Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, which has also been called a record player, or today DJs would probably call it a turntable. 2 years later, in 1879, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Or let me qualify that. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb after a couple other dozen people had invented the light bulb. You see, Thomas didn't really invent a whole heck of a lot. What he did was he improved upon other people's incredible genius. But when I was growing up, I was taught that Thomas Edison invented all these hundreds and thousands of things. But he really didn't, did he? In 1884, Mark Twain publishes The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Also in 1884, a man named Nikola Tesla emigrated to the United States of America. 3 years later, in 1887, Thomas Edison pushed for the use of direct current. Now, you may not be aware of this, but when you plug something into your wall in your home, that is alternating current. And it has many advantages. It also is a bit dangerous, but it has many advantages. The main one being that you can transmit it for long distances. Edison, the brilliant genius, was pushing direct current, which can go, I don't know, maybe several hundred feet and then peter out. But he was so ruthless that he attacked, people like Nikola Tesla who wanted alternating current. He attacked them. He did things like give public demonstrations where he would shock an animal and kill it in front of the crowd to show how dangerous alternating current is. Of course, the solution to that is to just not touch alternating current and you won't die. Thomas Edison was pushing for a form of electricity that would have slowed down the development of this nation by hundreds of years. Nikola Tesla was pushing for exactly what we got, which advanced this nation very rapidly. In the year 2 years later, in the year 1889, on May 31st, the Johnstown flood occurred in Pennsylvania, wiped out the city of Johnstown. The flood occurred when the dam that was created by rich elitists so that they could build their country club and go fishing, it was a poorly built dam, and it collapsed. 2,200 Americans died, $500 million in property damage adjusted for today. It was also the first major disaster relief by the American Red Cross, at that time led by Clara Barton. Once again, I emphasize that poorly built dam was created by rich elitists, people like Andrew Carnegie, all the rich folk of the world. They would be the Bill Gates and the Jack Dorseys of today. They created that dam for their own purposes, for that country club so they could go fishing. But they didn't care about all the people they ended up killing with it. This has been going on for a long time, folks. In the year 1895, a book was published by Gustave Le Bon called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. This was not well, he wasn't an American, but it's extremely significant. It was the first real analysis of mass mentality, how to manipulate people by associating them with an identity, with a group. That was 1895. That book was read and appreciated by a man later named Adolf Hitler. The year 1900 was the very beginning of the popular amateur radio, shortwave radio. Again, a means of communication which, if you do it right, can even allow you to communicate all the way around the world. The thing was, this was amateur radio. And that means that Joe Average in his house, in his basement, in his shed, in his garage, could begin learning science, physics on their own, and taking part in this incredible innovation in radio, television, broadcasting technology. 1 year later, in 1901, the first mass-produced automobile began production. No, it was not made by Henry Ford. That's what you're taught in school. It was made by Oldsmobile, Ransom Olds. It was called the Oldsmobile Curved Dash. He was the first one to invent the assembly line for mass-producing automobiles. However, Henry Ford did invent, he improved upon the assembly line into a moving assembly line for his vehicles later. 1903, 2 years later, on December 17th, the Wright brothers achieved the first sustained powered flight of human beings at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. That was American ingenuity, because Americans were free to experiment. If they had tried that today, everything from OSHA to health departments to every other department in the government would have prevented them from doing that experiment. You know why? Because many people lost their lives trying to build a plane that could fly. But back then, people were free. And because of that today, everyone, we could fly when we were free. In a totalitarian society, someone else decides whether you get to fly. The year 1906, 3 years later, were the first U.S. marijuana restrictions. And the reason for it is because of what it did to people. You might want to look into that. The year 1912 was the Chinese Revolution. That's when Emperor Puyi abdicated, and China disintegrated into a Mad Max fiasco of warring warlords that didn't get taken care of until much later with Chairman Mao. That was 1912. In 1913, Henry Ford began that first moving assembly line for cars. Oh, hey, that was 10 years after Oldsmobile. Wow. How about that? I was always told Henry Ford started that. Also in 1913, on December 23rd, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating the Federal Reserve. December 23rd, interesting, and there weren't any cars in the world really. That's right before Christmas, isn't it? Turns out that most of Congress was at home for the holidays. It was only a few people, you might even call them conspirators, who created the Federal Reserve. Read a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island to learn a little more about that. I will mention one more thing. The Federal Reserve Act in 1913, the Federal Reserve was essentially what Abraham Lincoln was trying to stop, something like a national bank, or control usurped from the Constitution over our currency. Remember, Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th. 1914, World War I breaks out, called at the time the Great War. Unlike anything the world had ever seen before. There were 9 million military deaths, 13 million civilian deaths. Yes, more civilians died than military combatants. And the after effects of that war, including the Spanish flu, killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 100 million human beings. And for what? What came out of it? At the end of that war, the boundaries were essentially the same, but a couple of empires were gone. The German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, etc. In the middle of that war, 1915, a German U-boat, submarine, sank the Lusitania. 128 Americans died in that. The next year, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected as President of the United States using the slogan, "He kept us out of war." 1 year later, he got us into World War I. Now, in all fairness, there was, in the beginning of 1917, in January, the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by Great Britain. And in that telegram, Germany was trying to convince Mexico to attack the United States, because Germany knew that the United States would get involved if they started using their U-boats again. They asked Mexico to attack the United States, and they promised that in return they would help Mexico regain Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And that was one of the main reasons why Americans allowed us to get into World War I. And on April 6 of 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. 1 year later, in 1918, the Russian Revolution began. That took about 4 years to resolve itself, where the Bolsheviks ended up in charge. But the Bolsheviks, among their first actions, was to take the Tsar's entire family down into a basement and shoot them all dead, including the children. I'm going to make one comment here. Probably shouldn't, but I'm going to do it. The Bolsheviks would be comparable today. Not exactly, but comparable to something like Antifa. 1918. November 11th, the armistice with Germany was signed and World War I officially ended. Thus began basically a decade of partying known as the Roaring Twenties throughout the 1920s. At the beginning of the 1920s, AM radio broadcasting began. So people could now sit at home and listen to their radio, and they could actually hear other people speaking. It was the creation of a new type of celebrity, not the Mark Twain type, where the man actually had talent and skill and personality, but now it was just whoever some random corporation chose to put in front of you by default became a celebrity, whether they had any talent or skill or anything to say at all. It also began the implementation of what Gustave Le Bon had warned about in his book called The Crowd. Because for the first time really in human history, one person could now broadcast to millions of people, and they couldn't question what they're saying directly at that moment. 1 year later, 1 year into the 20s, 1921, a company called Radio Shack was founded. 1921 to 1923, the Teapot Dome scandal under the Warren G. Harding administration. In that scandal, that involved the bribery of government officials by oil companies. Now back then, before total lawlessness had taken over this country, it was investigated, it was talked about in the news media, it was dealt with. And the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Bacon Fall, became the first presidential cabinet member to go to prison. When have we seen that happen in the last several decades? The man committed a crime, and he went to prison for it. That was the 1920s. Teapot Dome scandal. 1922, that's when the Russian Revolution more or less ended with the Bolsheviks in charge. But at the same time, one of the leaders of that, the two leaders were Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. Vladimir Lenin became incapacitated by illness. And so, a man who had been working in the background all this time, doing a lot of dirty work, basically what you might call a Soviet or a Russian Gestapo, very violent, a man named Joseph Stalin ended up taking over the Soviet Union. He was part of the militant wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Let me repeat that, please. Joseph Stalin, the man responsible ultimately for around 50 million deaths of his own people, was part of the militant wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. which doesn't have a perfect analogy today, but if you think of a cross between Bernie Sanders and Antifa, you're on the right track. Maybe for salt, throw in some Nancy Pelosi. In the year 1920, prohibition of alcohol began. This lasted for 13 years, 1920 to 1933. One of the consequences was the rise of criminals, gangsters, bootleggers. But another consequence was that the rates of liver cirrhosis and alcoholic psychosis, infant mortality declined. The reason is because alcohol is incredibly dangerous. And yet, after all the smoking bans were passed, cancer rates have only skyrocketed. Just something to think about. In 1925, a book called The Great Gatsby was published, written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. In the year 1925, in July, the Scopes monkey trial. There was a law against teaching evolution in schools. But some liberal teacher decided to break it, Mr. Scopes. So they had a trial for that. Now, defending for Mr. Scopes was Clarence Darrow, one of the most famous lawyers of the time. The lawyer that they brought in to basically prosecute Scopes was named William Jennings Bryan. He had run for president. He was a big, huge player in American politics and American law at the time. In the trial, Clarence Darrow had no defense. Technically, Scopes was just breaking the law. End of story. Period. That's it. So what do you do if you have no defense? Well, in law, you basically lie. And you distract people. You don't pay attention to what's important. What he did was he called William Jennings Bryan, the lawyer for the prosecution, basically, the lawyer who was bringing these charges against Scope, he called him in as a witness because William Jennings Bryan had publicly described himself as a, quote, Bible expert. And Darrow started asking him a bunch of questions. And guess what? William Jennings Bryan could not defend his faith in the Bible properly. And if you're a liar, and if you're a sleazebag, and if you use manipulative language, you could turn that into something that is supposed to make the Bible itself look like it's false, rather than just saying, well, maybe William Jennings Bryan was a blowhard who didn't know the Bible as well as he thought he did. And because of that, they got away with it. And the teaching of evolution took off in America. And I'm trying very hard not to refer you to my 8-part series on junk science when I talk about evolution. Also in 1925, the same year as the Scopes monkey trial, over in Germany, a book was published by a man named Adolf Hitler who was in prison. The book was called Mein Kampf, where he told exactly what he was going to do, including exactly the way in which he was going to manipulate the masses of Germany into following him against their best interests. In 1927, construction of Mount Rushmore began. In 1928, another important book was published by Edward Bernays. The book was simply called Propaganda. Edward Bernays was one of the pioneers of the Madison Avenue style, manipulating the public through advertising. Something like that television show Mad Men was trying to portray, although that was fictionalized. Don't get distracted by television versions of reality. 1929, the stock market crash and the Great Depression begins. The year 1929, Joseph Stalin expelled Leon Trotsky, one of the two founders of the Russian Revolution. Stalin expelled him from the Soviet Union for the crime of criticizing Stalin. Once again, freedom of speech seems to have a purpose. At the beginning of the 1930s is when FM radio broadcasting began. FM radio was much easier to hear and had much better range. It was more clear. In the 1930s, especially 1934 to 1940, the Midwest and America suffered from the Great Dust Bowl. There were many consequences to this, but one of them was a mass migration of Americans, farming Americans from Oklahoma and Texas to the state of California, specifically Southern California, where they were essentially enslaved by corporations after having been promised a new and better life there. The existence of those people and their descendants, especially in Southern and inland California today, helps to explain a lot of what's going on in California today. 1931, the Empire State Building was completed and opened. Over the next year or two, 1932 to 33, again over in the Soviet Union, Stalin waged his Holodomor, also known as the Terror Famine, where he basically starved 10 million of his own people to death in Ukraine. And if you wonder why Ukraine does not like Russia today, that's the reason, folks. In 1934, 1 year after the Holodomor killed those 10 million people, Stalin launched his Great Terror, which was his murder and imprisonment of political rivals. 2 years later, in 1936, the Hoover Dam opened. Remember, there were a lot of these big public projects during the Great Depression designed to get people employed. The Hoover Dam was one of them. Created electricity for the Pacific Southwest, California. Also in that year, 1936, a propaganda film called Reefer Madness was released. And the problem with that is that the general message of that film is exactly what people need to hear, but they created it in a really stupid, buffoonish way. So the message was not heard the way it should have been. 1 year later, in 1937, Joseph Stalin over in the Soviet Union was at it again with his Great Purge, also known as the Great Terror. Only about 1 million people were killed that time. In 1937, the same year, the Golden Gate Bridge opened to the public in San Francisco. 1 year later, another great scientific discovery, this time by a Swiss chemist. This wasn't American, but it's significant for America. 1938, this academic scientist, brilliant PhD type, invented LSD. 1939, The Grapes of Wrath was published, a book by John Steinbeck about the Great Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and that migration over to California from the Midwest. 1939, also a film called The Wizard of Oz was released. President Roosevelt won his 4th term around that time and became president again in 1940. But in 1940, on March 26, that is when Nancy Pelosi was born. She was born to a political machine family, which is essentially what you would call a political mafia. That was going to have serious consequences. That was 1940, less than 200 years into the existence of this country. An individual who was born who was going to help end the country. 1940, in July, Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl Ballads album was released. That is significant. And if you haven't heard my, shall we say, remakes of those songs on my channel, you might look for them. 1940, in August, Leon Trotsky, one of the founders of the Russian Revolution, the one who was expelled by Stalin for criticizing Stalin, well, that wasn't good enough. Stalin had him assassinated all the way across the world in Mexico City. Stalin's orders: assassinate Trotsky. You see, when you allow a political party to go after its political rivals with that kind of rabid hatred, it's not going to end well. 1940, a couple months later, in October, Charlie Chaplin released a film called The Great Dictator, where he tried to warn us about Adolf Hitler. Nobody listened. Also in 1940, 1 month later, the great engineering marvel of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Tacoma, Washington, collapsed 5 months after it opened. 1941, October, construction of Mount Rushmore was completed. Mount Rushmore opened to the public 1941. A couple months later, on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. Now, from 1941 through 1945, over in Europe was the Nazi Holocaust. In that Holocaust, 6 million Jews were exterminated, and countless others were exterminated as well, including gypsies, invalids, people with disabilities, ethnic Poles, and political dissidents, people who just disagreed with you politically, and that's the only reason they were exterminated in the Holocaust. Among these other groups, it was estimated that around 11 million were killed, in addition to the 6 million Jews that were exterminated for the purpose of ending the Jewish race on Earth. This is when Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, engaged in all of his human experimentation, where he treated these Jews and gypsies and such, invalids, as nothing more than lab rats. He could do anything he wanted to them. He could cause them as much pain and suffering and torture as he wanted to, with full government support. Sewing twins together. You can't even imagine the horrors of what Dr. Mengele's patients endured. And by the way, along those lines, the Nazi Holocaust only happened because it was set up not by military people, but it was set up to function in this manner by doctors, nurses, and scientists. In 1942, the Manhattan Project begins to build the atomic bomb. 1943, on January 7th, Nikola Tesla dies alone in his hotel room. Almost immediately, his papers and his belongings are seized by the FBI, who, after they look at them, say, "There's nothing to see here, folks." Nikola Tesla had been trying to invent things such as the broadcast of electricity, so that you don't need wires. He had a lot of interesting things he was working on. Those papers disappeared. The government took them. And with that, Nikola Tesla was forgotten to history until the 1980s, when a hair band going by the name of Tesla literally brought him back from the dead. Also in 1943, Mao Zedong became the leader of Communist China, which they laughingly called the People's Republic of China. The United States of America is a republic. We elect leaders to represent us, but they make their own decisions. If we don't like their decisions, we vote them out of office, and they no longer have any power. In the People's Republic of China, you don't elect representatives, they are appointed for you. And if they do things that you don't like, or if they do things that, say, murder you and your entire family and every person you know, you can't do a thing about it. That was 1943. Mao Zedong. 1944, 1 year later, June 6, was D-Day, an exhibition of American courage and character that would never be seen again in this country. To save all of Europe from the kind of totalitarianism under the Nazi boot and the communist boot, but especially the Nazi boot, those people basically went on a suicide mission. Did you know that the audio from the entire day was recorded by one radio station, and you can hear that on the internet? On many June 6th in recent years, I have spent the entire day listening to that audio as D-Day unfolded on the radio for the American people back then. That's when they invaded Europe and started taking on the Nazis. 1945, April 12. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, dies, and Truman becomes the president. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. One of the first things he was told a couple weeks later was about the existence of the atomic bomb, which he didn't know about. 1945, that was April 12 when Truman became president. May 8th was VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So D-Day was in June of 1944. Less than 1 year later, victory in Europe. The Americans made it happen. We ended the Nazi threat. We ended that totalitarian regime. with the help of the rest of the world, but if we hadn't gotten in there, all of Europe would have been lost. You see, when you're taken over by a totalitarian regime, if you don't have somebody who is good on the outside to come in and rescue you, then you will remain in that totalitarian regime, potentially for the rest of eternity. The United States of America was the nation, the only nation that had the capability to rescue other countries. And our generation just gave it away to a totalitarian regime. 1945, also, a couple months later in July, was the Trinity test of the atomic bomb. And unfortunately, it worked. A month later, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. 75,000 human beings were vaporized instantly. 3 days later, we dropped a bomb on Nagasaki. 37,000 human beings were killed instantly. Now, I'm not saying it was wrong to drop the bomb. It's not my job here to comment on that. I will just point out that's about 100,000 people. If we had invaded Japan, the number of American soldiers lost probably would have vastly exceeded that. About a month later, on September 2nd, the Japanese finally surrendered, ending World War II. Less than 1 year later, 1946, on June 14th, after the end of World War II, a man named Donald Trump was born in Queens, New York. Later in 1946, in September through October, there was a thing called justice. You're going to have to look up what justice is because we haven't seen it in this country in decades. This may be the last time the world has really seen it. It was called the Nuremberg trials. Trials and executions of the Nazi leaders for the atrocities that they committed, against crimes against humanity. Not some liberal leftist coming out and calling what you're doing that they don't like a crime against humanity, but something that any mentally stable human being would regard as a genuine, bona fide atrocity. The Nuremberg trials put those people on trial and executed them so that they could no longer hurt anybody ever again. There were two special subsets of trials at Nuremberg. One was called the doctor's trial, because again, the doctors made the Holocaust happen, and the scientists. There was another trial called the judge's trial, because the corrupt judges and lawyers also made the Holocaust happen. After World War II ended, the baby boom began, for obvious reasons if you know what the baby boom is. They started cranking out babies left and right once the party began after the end of World War II. Also, about that time is when the vinyl record, you know, the albums for music, the vinyl album record began taking off in popularity. Now at this point I need to backtrack a bit because I need to tell you about something that had happened in America for the whole first half of the 20th century. From the very beginning, you know, around 1900-ish, up until this time at the end of World War II. It was a movement called the eugenics movement, and it was huge in the United States, and it was led by progressives, academics, and, in quotation marks, scientists. The eugenics movement attempted to prove, remember the subtitle to Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species, where it talked about favored races? The eugenics movement was where one person says, you know, I feel that this person over here is inferior, and therefore it's my responsibility to do something about it. We either need to genetically change them, or we need to eliminate them. That was big in the United States of America up until the end of World War II, when where that leads was made evident at the Nuremberg trials. But that eugenics movement was led by progressives, academics, and so-called scientists. And the thing is, they never stopped, ever. They just took it underground. Blacks are inferior, racial purity, the same thing that Hitler was doing. And the progressives, academics, and scientists are still pursuing that today. In a different way. 1948, The Ed Sullivan Show premieres on CBS television. Got to understand how important that is. 1949, 1 year later, Russia successfully tests the atomic bomb, and we begin the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Where did they get the bomb? Well, partly because American citizens Julius and Ethel Rosenberg helped them get American atomic secrets. This nation executed them for doing that, for betraying the country, for putting not just our country at risk, but frankly the entire world at risk. But that was then. This is now. The 1950s generally became a prosperous and relatively quiet decade. However, the morals in America began to break down seriously. At the same time, there was a simultaneous rise of the covert deep state, the CIA, things of that nature. The people were not paying attention anymore. They were so exhausted from the war that they just went out and partied. They played with their new technology. They started challenging morals and going out and having fun, breaking the rules, rebelling against parents. That's where the beatnik era came in, for example. The 1950s. Also in the 1950s, the United States and other countries, well, particularly the Soviet Union, began to explode atomic bombs all over the place, spreading radiation all over the place. And yet they blame cancer on other things, don't they? 1951, a little 90-pound weakling who immigrated from Croatia. His name was, immigrated from Latvia, I believe. His name was Edward Leedskalnin. 1951, Edward Leedskalnin posts on the door of his home, which he called the Coral Castle, that said, "Going to the hospital." And in the hospital he died. The Coral Castle, which he had built over the years, is somewhat comparable to the pyramids of Giza. This 90-pound weakling somehow put together his own castle out of blocks that weigh up to 25 tons with no machinery. And nobody knows how he did it. But he did it right there in southern Florida, on American soil. You would think that legitimate scientists might wonder how that could happen. People who care about a sensible energy policy might be curious about how that could happen. But no one's ever looked into it, have they? 1 year later, 1952, in November, the United States successfully tested Ivy Mike, the first hydrogen thermonuclear bomb. This thing made the Hiroshima bomb look like a firecracker, 450 times more powerful than the Nagasaki bomb, equivalent to 10 million tons of TNT. 1953, 1 year later, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are executed by the U.S. government for their treason against the United States of America, and in doing so, they protected the United States of America from traitors like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, so that they could never hurt anybody ever again. It was the last time the United States of America would ever execute someone who had legitimately and demonstrably committed treason that I'm aware of. Timothy McVeigh was a bit different. In 1954, 1 year later, after Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed, 1954, The Tonight Show premieres with Steve Allen as the host. Also in that year, the first portable transistor radio became commercially available. Now people could hear these transmissions, these broadcasts, one person speaking to many who cannot challenge what they're being told. They could hear it all over the place, in the car, at the beach, wherever they want to go. They can be told something by other people that they can't verify or challenge. The late 1940s and into the 1950s had a phenomenon called McCarthyism. That was where they had the Committee on Un-American Activities. Basically, McCarthy was trying to fight against communism. He didn't really do it in the best way, but what he was trying to do was to save us from exactly what we're experiencing today. And even though he went about it in a pretty ruthless manner, the fact is he might have staved off what we're experiencing now by a good 20 or 30 years. Also in the 1940s, reel-to-reel tape recorders became available. Very significant. 1950 to 1953, the Korean War. You ever wonder where Rocket Man, North Korea, comes from? That's where it comes from, folks. 1950 to 53. The Soviet Union and China supported North Korea and their communists. Let me repeat that. The Soviet Union, the Communist Soviet Union, and Communist China, totalitarian societies which dehumanize their people and mass slaughter their own people, supported North Korean communists. The United States entered that war fighting against them. Also in 1953, the CIA began a program called MK Ultra. That was a mind control program that used things like drugs, the aforementioned LSD, more than any other. They used torture, they used abuse, including sexual abuse, and other horrific things in an effort to try to control people's minds. In other words, human experimentation. Kind of harkens back to what I talked about with Dr. Joseph Mengele under the Nazi regime, doesn't it? In fact, the CIA bought up the entire world's supply of LSD, and they introduced it deliberately into the United States, specifically through the medical profession. Most of that LSD was given to subjects without their knowledge. Just something to think about while you're getting the coronavirus vaccine, which hasn't been tested. 1953, also at the same time, Watson and Crick, and this is in quotation marks, discover the DNA double helix structure, for which they would win the Nobel Prize later on. Watson was an American scientist, Crick was from the UK. They're credited with discovering the double helix structure of DNA, which, among so many other things, basically makes a complete mockery out of the theory of evolution. But here's the thing. The person who actually discovered the double helix structure wasn't Watson and Crick. It was a woman named Rosalind Franklin. But academia and scientists and PhDs, the cult of academia, they don't like women accomplishing anything. So Watson and Crick got the credit. Rosalind Franklin got the shaft. In fact, she died young. She died very young from cancer. You know how she gathered the data to learn about the double helix structure? She did it by taking x-rays, exposing herself to radiation all that time. And the data she gathered from that was basically used by Crick and Watson, who went out and said, we did it. We did all the work. We deserve the Nobel Prize. We deserve the credit. That's science and academia for you folks. Also in 1953, same year, Joseph Stalin finally died, and Nikita Khrushchev took over as the leader of the Soviet Union. Now I mentioned before that throughout the 1950s, the beatniks became the dominant counterculture, subculture among young people in particular. Beatniks were defined by things like drug use, obviously, nonconformity, irresponsibility, an obsession with the self. I mean, just no concept of things that are outside yourself, like patriotism or community obligations or anything of that nature, helping the poor and the homeless. No, it's just all about you. And pseudo-intellectualism. That's where the beatniks came from. Charles Manson was a beatnik. He said so himself. He said, I'm not a hippie, I'm a beatnik. And he's right. That was his age. The beatniks were led by people like William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg. And they were responsible for a lot of the rise in drug abuse in this country. 1955, the Vietnam conflict begins. 1957, October 4th, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the very first space satellite, into low Earth orbit and began the space race. 1 year later, 1958, American Jack Kilby, over at Texas Instruments, he invents the first integrated circuit, or microchip. That is one of the most fascinating stories, one of the most amazing technological innovations ever. Something you really should look into. But the effect that was going to have on society, he could never have known. 1 year later, in 1959, the Cuban Revolution occurs and Fidel Castro takes power. And the good people of Cuba begin to live under a totalitarian regime that hurts and kills everybody who disagrees with the totalitarian regime. Right, what is it, about 30 miles from the coast of Florida, the United States of America. 1 year later, 1960, the Nixon-Kennedy debates were on television. The first televised presidential debates. People who were listening on the radio all agreed that Richard Nixon won. The people who watched it on television all agreed that Kennedy won. You might want to think about that and what that means, folks. If people are not thinking properly, if they're not well educated, and if they're not in control of their own intellects, it's really easy to be snookered by what you see, which may not be real. I'll say that one more time. The people who listened to the debates on the radio said that Nixon clearly won by what he said. The people watching it on television said that Kennedy clearly won by how he said it, what he looked like, appearances. 1 year later, in 1961, Dwight D. Eisenhower gives his farewell address to the American people, and in there he warns the American people about two things in particular. One is an ever-growing military-industrial complex, and the second one was junk science. The corruption of science for political and social purposes and for the power of money. Eisenhower warned us, 1961. Together, you could call that the deep state. 1961, in January, President Kennedy becomes President of the United States, and the Camelot era begins, with Jackie Kennedy and the little children running around the White House. 1961, in April, about 3 months later, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred and completely failed and blew up in Kennedy's face. That's something he had inherited. He did not initiate it. He did not want it. That was our invasion of Cuba. Failed miserably. 1962, another book was published. Now, this was published in France by a Frenchman, but 3 years later, in 65, it would be published in America. The author is named Jacques Ellul, and the book is called Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes. And once again, the theoretical development of how to manipulate large masses of people, how you can have one or two or a small number of people manipulate millions of other people into doing exactly what that tiny handful of people want to do. It was all there right in front of your eyes the whole time. But folks, for all the times you've watched Friends on television or listened to Lady Gaga, have you ever read the book Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes? How are you going to defend yourself against it if you don't know anything about it? These books were there all the time. I read them decades ago. Also in 1962, Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods was where leaders of the CIA and military leaders went to President Kennedy, and they said that they wanted to stage false flag attacks against American citizens and blame it on Cuba in order to justify a war with Cuba. In other words, they wanted to be the ones who killed American citizens for some higher purpose. The end justifies the means. One of the suggestions in Operation Northwoods, which you can read yourself, it's declassified now, was to shoot down an American jetliner and to blame Cuba. You know, kind of like, like Flight 93 was shot down and everyone blamed Osama bin Laden. Just to give you a visual of what they were suggesting. The plan was vehemently rejected by President Kennedy, and he made a lot of enemies in the government when he rejected that plan. That was 1962. He would be dead 1 year later. 1962, in August of 27, for something a little more positive, NASA launched the Mariner 1 and Mariner 2 probes to Venus. These probes did not have cameras, but it was the first time we were going to send something man-made out to one of the other planets. Mariner 1 failed, and it had to be destroyed shortly after launch, but Mariner 2 made it. It went to Venus 3.5 months later, and it sent back some telemetry data, the first close-up data we had ever gotten from another planet. Amazing. Also in 1962, on October 1st, Johnny Carson took over as the host of The Tonight Show. Very significant in cultural terms. Also in 1962, about 2 weeks after Johnny Carson took over The Tonight Show, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. That's when Khrushchev sent nuclear weapons to Cuba. They were being shipped to Cuba, and Kennedy intercepted them and put up a blockade. And he said, "Oh, no, you don't. You're not putting those missiles 30 miles off the U.S. coast. It ain't going to happen." It brought us to the brink of nuclear war. It was probably the most, up until what just happened this year with the overthrow of Donald Trump, this was probably the scariest thing that American citizens have ever gone through over a period of a couple days. And the thing was, back then they could visualize what the outcome could be if there was a nuclear war, and the people today don't have the foggiest idea what they're in for as a result of the overthrow of Donald Trump. The Cuban Missile Crisis was raw, sheer terror for everyone in America. But this strong, principled U.S. president won, and the Soviet Union backed down. That's why it's good to have a very strong and principled U.S. president in office, like we did up until the beginning of 2021. 1963, Timothy Leary, an academic, PhD, big brain scientist, education, and others like him began promoting the use of LSD, particularly among young people. You know, the young people that responsible, mature adults are supposed to protect and nurture. But he was promoting LSD usage among those kids. Also at that time, Kennedy in one of his speeches warned about a cabal that was working in secret using covert means to basically undermine the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. government, and American freedom. In 1963, I believe it was in August, President Kennedy's newborn son, Patrick, died. Patrick was 2 days old. The whole nation mourned. But then a few months later, on November 22nd, President Kennedy himself died. He was assassinated in Dallas. When President Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson took over as president, and he immediately began to escalate the Vietnam conflict into a Vietnam War. 1964, on January 11th, the Surgeon General's report on smoking and health was read to the news media in a smoke-filled room. That's the one that's claimed that smoking was responsible for cancer, emphysema, heart disease, locusts, asteroids, and pretty much every other thing in the world. It wasn't all those nuclear bombs being exploded across the country for a decade. It wasn't that. It was people smoking cigarettes. One thing I'd like to point out to you that is never, ever pointed out to you, though, is who is this Surgeon General? You've heard of the Surgeon General's report, but who was the Surgeon General? Well, his name was Luther Terry. Prior to becoming Surgeon General, he had been the Assistant Professor of Preventative Medicine and Public Health at the University of Texas. The cult of academia, health. Look at my 50 existential threats to America, folks. Public health, health fascism, preventative medicine. Preventative means we're not going to try to cure a disease at all. We're going to manipulate people's behavior, or we're going to dictate people's behavior at the end of a gun so that the health problem doesn't happen in the first place. That's what that Surgeon General did. He was also assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Look them up sometime, folks. Johns Hopkins. Look them up. He was also professor of medicine and community medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He worked with the National Institutes of Health, a rabidly anti-smoking group. He was consultant to the American Cancer Society, a rabidly anti-smoking group. He served as president of, quote, University Associates, which was a, quote, non-profit consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. I refer you to my junk science videos, and especially the last one where I talked about how these so-called non-profit but very wealthy firms lobby and take control over our senators and congressmen. That's who that Surgeon General was, by the way, just in case you were ever wondering who the Surgeon General was behind this famous Surgeon General's report on smoking and health. The man was a rabid hater of smoke, smokers, anything to do with tobacco. Might be your first clue as to why it was then that report came out. And what was the report itself, by the way? The report, remember, this is a report. This is not a study. They didn't study anything. What they did was they went and they read and they analyzed over 7,000 scientific articles and papers. And then they wrote a report on what their perception was of the general conclusion you get from reading all these. They didn't validate or verify any of those 7,000. They just read them. If you ever want to prove a point, folks, remember all those books I told you about propaganda earlier in here? If you ever want to prove a point to someone, like the point that if you throw a ball up into the air, it will go all the way up into space and it won't fall down. You know, Isaac Newton was a liar. If that's the point you want to prove, what you do is you get 7,000 people writing on the topic. Because when you get to cherry pick which ones you talk about, which ones you quote, and which ones you throw away, when you get to be in charge of the 7,000 pieces of data that you're looking at, and then you get to create your own conclusion from that, you can prove that throwing a ball into the air will keep going straight up until it goes into outer space, and that Isaac Newton was a liar. It's called a meta-analysis. It is not science, it is junk science, and it is responsible for a lot of the pain and suffering that Americans have endured over the last several decades. By the way, Luther Terry, the Surgeon General, who was so against, I'm not going near a cigarette, I hate smokers, blah, 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 he died of heart failure. Yep. Good thing he didn't smoke. He might have, died of heart failure, I guess, according to his report. 1964 also, in February, the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. That was a huge, huge cultural milestone for many, many reasons. June of 1964, the Federal Trade Commission mandated warnings on cigarette advertisements. And coming up soon in 69, warnings on cigarette packs as well. The reason I mention this is to point out that June of 1964 was 5 months after January of 1964. January is when the Surgeon General report came out. 5 months later, the Federal Trade Commission is mandating that private companies on legal products put a warning. When have you ever seen the government move that fast on anything? 5 months later. There's more here than meets the eye, folks. There's a reason for this. And remember, that was not even based on a scientific study. It was based on a report of people who read a bunch of papers that claimed to be scientific studies, but nobody actually validated them to determine whether they were accurate or reliable or biased. 1964, the Warren Commission report on the assassination of John F. Kennedy was released. The Warren Commission found that it was a lone gunman who killed the President of the United States from a great distance, upstairs, through an open window with a piece of garbage rifle bought from Sears and Roebuck. They also created the single bullet theory, where one bullet went all over the place. The Warren Commission said, nothing to see here, folks. But remember, at that time, nobody had seen the Zapruder film that we've all seen. The only thing the American people had to go on was what that Warren Commission report said. So the people accepted it, and they believed it. Also in 1964, in September, a television show called Gilligan's Island debuts. CBS would cancel that show after 3 seasons. The reason I point this out, among other things, is I want to point out that Dawn Wells, who played Mary Ann on that show, she received more fan mail than any other actor on that show. I want you to remember that, please. Dawn Wells, who played Mary Ann, received most of the fan mail on Gilligan's Island, which ran in 1964, before I was even born. I also want to point out that the U.S. Coast Guard received several, if not many, telegrams from members of the public pleading with them to go and rescue the castaways that they had saw on television. You see, there's a problem with broadcasting and there's a problem with television, folks. Some people cannot tell what they see on television from reality, and that can be a problem if the people you see on television are telling lies. Also in 1964, NASA launched Mariners 3 and 4 to Mars. Mariner 3 failed. Mariner 4 arrived at Mars, and this one had a camera. Granted, a crappy black and white one, but it gave us the first close-up photos of another planet ever. Absolutely amazing technological accomplishment. 1 year later, in 1965, in February, Malcolm X was assassinated. He was my favorite civil rights leader. Malcolm X assassinated. Same year, 1965, Star Trek premieres on television. And once again, this time NBC would cancel it after 3 seasons. Yeah, those network executives really know what the people want. Or is it that they decide what the people are going to see rather than giving them what the people want? That's the reason I mentioned Gilligan's Island and Star Trek, folks. They canceled those series after 3 years. Who's really in charge of what you're seeing there? Is it you or is it them? 1 year later, in 1966, the 8-track tape became commercially available. Same year, 1966, groundbreaking began in New York City on the World Trade Center. 1 year later, 1967, it was called the Summer of Love, and several very important albums were released. The Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Odyssey and Oracle by the Zombies, and I believe Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys was also there. I'm not positive, but Are You Experienced by Hendrix might also have been from 1967. But what you had going on in 1967, remember the Beatles in 64 on Ed Sullivan with their floppy hair and their very respectful speech with Ed Sullivan? Ed Sullivan loved those guys. Very fine young men, he called them. 3 years later, in 67, they're growing their hair out long, and you're starting to see this hippie generation, which was just utterly disgraceful in every way, shape, and form. 1968, 1 year later, April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated by, of course, a lone gunman. That was on April 4th. June 6th of that year, a couple months later, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated by a lone gunman as he was about to win the primary for President of the United States. Several months later, 1969, in February, was the very first time anyone in the public had ever seen the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination. But the only people who got to see it was the jury at Clay Shaw's trial. If you ever watch Oliver Stone's movie called JFK, which I'm not saying it's a great movie or anything like that, but that's the event. It was the first time American citizens had actually been allowed by the government to see the execution of President Kennedy, and they were horrified because as soon as they saw it, they knew that the Warren Commission report was garbage. 1969, a couple months after that, on July 20th, Apollo 11 lands on the moon. And man walks on the moon for the very first time and plants an American flag there. Seems to show some patriotism, some pride, not just in the nation, but what the people of this nation could accomplish working together under the protection of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. That's what we could accomplish. The Soviets sent some little beach ball up there called Sputnik, which just fell right back to Earth. We landed human beings on the moon and planted our flag there a decade later. That's what a free country can accomplish, folks. 1 month after the moon landings were the Sharon Tate murders. A couple days later after that, August 15th, was the Woodstock Music Festival in New York. 400,000 people attended. Later that year, I believe in December, the Manson family was arrested and charged with the Tate murders and LaBianca murders. And that brought an abrupt end to the hippie era. I won't comment any further on that. The Vietnam War was in full swing. Young Americans were being drafted into this war to go over there and just get slaughtered. 1970 and 71, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center finally were completed and opened. 1970, in May, was the Kent State Massacre, where the National Guard just got nervous at a protest and fired and killed some young Americans. 1970, October, a few months after that, the Public Broadcasting System, PBS, begins. 1971, the government bans cigarette advertising on radio and television, a legal product, law-abiding industry with really more customers than probably any product except bread. No other product anywhere at all, but that one product is not allowed to advertise on radio or television. Based again on that Surgeon General's report and the anti-smoking hate groups that were behind all that. Also in 1971, a book called Rules for Radicals was published by Saul Alinsky. This is a book that is read and adhered to by so many names that you know today. The book promoted things like deceit, lying, manipulation, force. It treated human beings like animals. But you're a better animal, so you have every right and every obligation and every responsibility to manipulate them and deceive them and to use force if necessary to get what you want. 1971 to 1974 was the Watergate scandal. It was 1973 when the first public disclosure of the Watergate scandal. It's one of the first things I remember in my life was seeing coverage of that on television. It's talked about all the time. Also in 1973, Roe versus Wade. The U.S. Supreme Court legalized abortion in America. And in the years that have come since then, this nation has murdered some 50 million human beings. And anyone who believes in a just God, who does not expect this country to be judged for that, then I would claim that you don't really truly believe in a just God. 50 million of our most helpless citizens, the ones who we are obligated morally, just familially, just as the father and mother of these children, you're obligated to protect them with your very life, and we murdered them instead. And the government protects people's so-called right to murder these children. That was 1973. 1974, August 9, President Nixon resigns and Gerald R. Ford becomes President of the United States. Gerald R. Ford was one of the members of the Warren Commission. 1975 was the Pine Ridge shootout that put Leonard Peltier in prison with the American Indian Movement. Also in 1975, on March 6, the first ever U.S. network showing of the Zapruder film. So in other words, the American people themselves, not just some jury in one courtroom, but the American people could see President Kennedy being shot and his head going back and to the left, even though the Warren Commission said he was shot from above and behind. And the outcry is one of the reasons why they had another investigation into the Kennedy assassination. You got to wonder why the government didn't want people to see that Zapruder film. What is it today that we could be seeing that we're not allowed to see that might help us understand the truth? 1975, April 30th, the fall of Saigon, which basically ended the Vietnam War as the Americans did their airlift and cut and ran for it. 1975 also, Microsoft is founded by Bill Gates and I can't remember the other fella, Paul Allen, right? 1976 was America's bicentennial celebration. I was there, folks. I was young, but I was there, and I remember it. It was a celebration. It was a show of patriotism, not just blind adherence to a country. This was a love of the country and the people and what we had done, what we were capable of doing, of the freedom that we had established and protected. It was beautiful. The 200th anniversary of the United States of America's founding with the Declaration of Independence. It was a great celebration. And it didn't take long for the next generation to just give it all away in favor of totalitarian dictatorship. And also in 1976, Apple Computers was founded. And in 1976, George Herbert Walker Bush became the head of the CIA. In January of 1977, Jimmy Carter was sworn in as President of the United States. 1977, NASA launched the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 space probes to study the outer solar system. 1978. Now remember, for several years prior to that, for at least 5 or 6 years, the disco era was going on. So bell bottoms and that kind of beat-oriented music that wasn't really... the disco was actually pretty good because you really did have people playing the instruments. There was real grooves and everything. It wasn't the kind of mechanical, machine-made stuff we have today with hip-hop and everything, but it wasn't, it wasn't the greatest music in the world. In 1978, Eddie Van Halen just killed it, just absolutely destroyed disco in an instant, just by existing. He played Eruption one time and the whole world remembered, oh, there's such a thing as good music. 1979, January 16th, the Shah of Iran, under pressure from a growing revolution over there, flees into exile. The Shah of Iran is someone who we installed, the CIA installed, I think back in the 50s. He wasn't a great leader. He was corrupt, he was vicious, but he oversaw an Iran that was free for the most part. The people there were free. Look back at the photos. The women would walk around in short shorts. They watched American films. They were free. It was a Western country and very prosperous. They were friends with Israel. But according to declassified documents that seem to indicate that the Carter administration had either allowed or outright helped the Ayatollah Khomeini with his revolution over there, the Shah of Iran fled ultimately to the United States. I remember that as well when I was young. And with the Islamic Revolution, the Iranian people immediately were no longer free. That was 1979. This is the year 2021, and those people are still not free. You try wearing short shorts over there now, folks. A woman with her hair out there, not wearing a burqa. You give it a try. See how that goes for you. Jimmy Carter was possibly instrumental in that happening. Democrat President Jimmy Carter. I'm sorry, folks. It just kind of struck me as I was saying that's most of my life. That's 4/5 of my life. Those Iranian people have not been free. But they were free for the first decade of my life, and now my own people here in the United States just gave it all up voluntarily. At least the Iranians had to be violent and take over their government to become a totalitarian society. My generation just gave it away. (1979), the Voyager 1 probe reaches Jupiter. It sent back the first close-up photos of Jupiter. Wow. Do I ever remember that. 1979, the Sony Walkman cassette player is introduced, where you can use cassette tapes portably. Now you could choose what you listen to portably. You're not at the mercy of a radio station. Remember, radio was huge back then. A disc jockey was the real thing back then. Now they're just DJs, but they used to be disc jockeys. They used to be important, significant members of the community. Sony Walkman helped to erase that. Gave people the ability to listen to what they wanted to, wherever they wanted to, even though they were big and bulky. I remember jogging with those things. Crazy. 1979. One of the worst things that's ever happened to the country, folks. Jimmy Carter creates the U.S. Department of Education. 1979, November 4th, right after the Iranian Revolution, well, the Iranians stormed the American embassy, which is U.S. soil, sovereign U.S. soil. That's what an embassy is. The Iranians stormed it, and they took 52 Americans hostage and kept them hostage for more than a year. During that time, in 1980, cable television became easily available and popular. It had been around for quite some time, but the technology had come to the point where you could easily get it in your home. I remember when we got cable TV. What I want to point out is that prior to cable television, what you had were local stations that would switch back and forth between their local broadcasts and a feed from their national network, like NBC or ABC, CBS. But these stations only operated from around 6 a.m. in the morning to midnight. When they started in the morning, they would play the national anthem. When they ceased operations at midnight, they would play the national anthem. That's what people saw. That's what people encountered every single day when they're watching television, the national anthem. With cable television, never again. Also, when local stations were the only ones broadcasting, it was impossible for you to vegetate in front of a television set between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. By definition, you had to actually do something with your life, at least during those hours, even if you're just sleeping. But you couldn't vegetate in front of the idiot box for those 6 hours. With cable television, you can vegetate your entire life away without a break. In the year 1980 also, Carl Sagan's Cosmos series was first broadcast on public television. One of the biggest propagators of scientific disinformation in the history of the world. And unfortunately, I was very young at the time and I fell for it. 1980, April 24th, was a failed attempt to rescue the Iranian hostages. Carter sent over the military to try to rescue them, but they had technical problems and it didn't happen. 1980, May 4th. That's when the U.S. Department of Education began operations as a cabinet-level department. They have a Secretary of Education. Again, one of the worst things that has ever happened to this country. Absolutely devastating. In fact, in 1980, the Republican Party platform for the 1980 election called for the immediate termination of the U.S. Department of Education and the cabinet post. See, they understood the problem with it. But the problem was Reagan inherited a Democratic Congress, and they didn't allow it. The Democrats wanted the U.S. Department of Education, and the country has suffered tremendously as a result. In 1980, in May, Sierra Online published the first video game with rudimentary graphics. It was called Mystery House. That company was founded by Ken and Roberta Williams inside their home, and they became the first heroes of the video gaming industry. They were my heroes when I was in computer science back in the 80s. 1980, June 1st, another dreadful day in American history. CNN launches on cable television, founded by an anti-smoking fanatic named Ted Turner. So now, the 500-year-old anti-smoking hate groups now had a leader who owned what would quickly become the largest propagator of one-way information to the American people. And I want you to understand how important that is, and to think about what happened with the anti-smoking laws and such after CNN took on that kind of power. Was it really based on science, folks? Or was it based on what people were being told on the idiot box? Remember, when Prohibition happened, all those diseases associated with alcohol went down. When the smoking bans happened in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, cancer went up. Think about that. 1980, November, Voyager 1 flies by Saturn and provides us with our first close-up images of that gorgeous planet and its rings. But 1 month later, on December 8th of 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed right outside his front door by a crazed lunatic. 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidency. Now, for Reagan to be nominated, he had to accept something, a term that he did not want. He did not want this. But this was the rules of the party. If you want to be the nominee for president, you must accept George H.W. Bush as your vice president. And Reagan hated it, but it was politically necessary. So, Reagan takes office in January of 1981, and let's see, January of 1981, 3 months later in March, Reagan is shot. And he's shot by John Hinckley Jr. Supposedly, the mass media, CNN, told you that it was to impress Jodie Foster, to impress an actress. That's why John Hinckley shot Reagan. I don't know how much you believe in coincidences, folks. You can only have so many coincidences before it really isn't coincidental. But just so you know, John Hinckley's brother, Scott, was a good friend of Neil Bush, which is one of George H.W. Bush's sons. With about 250 million people in America at that time, what are the odds? If that assassination attempt had been successful, George H.W. Bush would have become president at the very beginning of Reagan's term, and we'd be living in a different world today. You might think about that as you watch the inauguration of the Banana Republic of America's new president, Joe Biden. Another interesting thing happened on the very day that Reagan took office. Iran released the hostages after more than a year. Now I remember, because, again, I was pretty young then, but I remember when that happened, I perceived it as the Iranians were scared to death of Reagan. That Reagan was going to come over there and just burn them to the ground. It's like, you don't take our hostages, we don't put up with that. That's how I perceived it, because the media kind of pushed that to some extent. Of course, over the last several decades, we've learned the truth. It was actually a scam. We were selling arms. We basically bought the hostages by selling arms to Iran. Now, the 1980s themselves, I am so grateful that that's when I really grew up. That's when I went to high school and college. I'm really grateful. It was a wonderful time, at least at that time. Of course, it was setting the stage for a horror to come, which we are experiencing now, but as a kid, it was a great time to grow up. It was a lot better than being shut up in your home wearing a mask all the time and not being able to socialize with other people your age. It was a relatively prosperous period, much like the 50s, but there was stuff brewing in the background that was going to come back to haunt us, and nobody was paying attention. Fortunately, I woke up around 87, 88, and I started seeing these things, and I've been fighting against them ever since. That's why you're hearing this broadcast from me right now. 1981. Reagan was shot on the 30th of March. In April, about a month later, the Space Shuttle Columbia launches, the first launch of the Space Shuttle. That was very significant for me. That's one of the reasons I was going to study aeronautical engineering and wanted to work for NASA, because I didn't know what NASA was at the time, did I? I was listening to Carl Sagan. I wasn't listening to reality. 1981, in August, the IBM personal computer is launched commercially. I'm resisting the urge to tell you the stories about that. I remember it well. 1982, 1 year later, the music CD, also known as the compact disc, was introduced. It's about 3 years later before I got my first CD player. 1986, January 24th, the Voyager 2 flies past the planet Uranus. Amazing. Discovered that Uranus had rings. 1986. Also, about 4 days later, after Voyager flew past Uranus, the Space Shuttle Challenger explodes with 7 astronauts killed on launch. So think about what that means. 1986. Okay, I was in college then. I was in college, basically beginning my studies for aeronautical engineering to work for NASA someday. Voyager 2 flies past Uranus, and it's great. That's a program from back in the old school NASA. The Space Shuttle was from new school NASA. Space Shuttle blew up 5 years after the program started, killing 7 people aboard. And if you studied the report of why that happened, it was political. It was not an engineering flaw. It was purely due to politics. Stupid people running the show. Stupid, dangerous people. That's why they died. In the mid-1980s, we had the Iran-Contra scandal, and the Americans at that time never really did figure out what that thing even was, but it was kind of related to the idea of Iran releasing the hostages literally a couple of minutes after Reagan is sworn in as president. You see, we were selling arms to Iran and using the money from that to fund the Contras in Nicaragua who were fighting against the communist takeover there. But then it descended into madness and it became a drug running scam. And this wasn't so much Reagan who was doing it, it was more George H.W. Bush, as we're going to see, with consequences for all of us. So Ollie North, he became famous in the mid-80s because of that. But moving right along though, 1986, the Proposition 65 scam is passed in California. This ridiculous law is called, on paper, it's called the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986. That's what California calls it. The Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986. Today, in the year 2021, what that law means is that a company that builds guitars can be sued into bankruptcy by California lawyers if they don't label their electric guitar as, quote, containing chemicals known by the state of California to cause cancer and reproductive harm, unquote. One of my existential threats to America, folks, is health fascism. Proposition 65 is one of the worst scams in American history. And technically, if you read the actual documents, technically, according to the letter of the law, not where they use a law as a weapon like they do with Proposition 65, but if you obey that law for real, everybody, then a newborn baby in California should carry a warning label because they contain chemicals known by the state of California to cause cancer and reproductive harm. And if you think that's absurd, just wait till we get to coronavirus. 1986 also. All right, there was something going on you probably don't know about. 1986, Barry Seal, a pilot, was assassinated. Why does that matter? Well, because he was a pilot running drugs for Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush's complicated, messy scheme, the Iran-Contra, all this stuff. You can't even tell what's what anymore. There was so much nasty stuff going on there. When Barry Seal was killed, he had George Bush's personal phone number in his pocket. Most drug runners don't have that. But this one's significant because Barry Seal was running drugs, and this program that was doing it was running drugs into a little town, little teeny weeny town called Mena, Arkansas. Mena, Arkansas is a stone's throw away from Little Rock, Arkansas, which at the time was occupied by a man named Bill Clinton, who was the governor of Arkansas. In 1987, in Mena, Arkansas, two teenagers, Kevin Ives, who was 17, and Don Henry, who were 16, they're just out having fun, and they went to the wrong place, though, and they just happened to stumble upon one of these planes being unloaded, the drugs being unloaded, and they were executed. They were shot dead, and they left their bodies on the train tracks to be run over by the next train. Again, things like that generally aren't going to happen without the knowledge and approval of local, if not state, authorities. I repeat, Mena, Arkansas is a stone's throw away from Little Rock, Arkansas, which is where the governor of Arkansas, who no one in America had heard of, named Bill Clinton, was located. And one of the guys involved in that drug running, when he was killed, he had George Bush's phone number in his pocket. Are you starting to connect the dots, folks? It didn't matter who won in 1992, because it was the same people. Rest in peace, Kevin Ives and Don Henry, two teenagers who were killed by this monstrous machine that has been attacking us for decades now. 1987, I believe it was, when George H.W. Bush, now running for president, said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Although actually he said it more like, "Read my lips, no new taxes." course, as soon as he became president, he raised taxes, didn't he? Unlike Donald Trump, who actually kept his promises. 1988, Proposition 99, California strikes again. Health fascism strikes again. Proposition 99, remember these propositions, if you watch my junk science videos, propositions are the way to get around a responsible legislature. Believe it or not, California wasn't going to pass stupid laws like Proposition 65 or these anti-smoking ban laws. They knew what was going on. The way you get around that is you turn it into a public referendum, and then you scare the heebie-jeebies out of the public long enough so that they vote for it. Some of these propositions even amend the Constitution. So the anti-smoking coup was Proposition 99. In 1988, that's when they convinced the people of California to pass a tax increase, only this time those taxes went to anti-smokers, anti-smoking hate groups. Do you see the problem with that, folks? You have a hate group who lobbies, and I say lobbies in quotes, to get a law passed that will steal money at gunpoint. It will use the government's gun to steal money from smokers, or from the object of their hatred, and it will give the money that is stolen to the same hate group who lobbied for that law in the first place. Do you see the problem with that? You see, in California, legally raising taxes required a 2/3 majority in the state legislature. There was no way they were going to get it. So they went to the people and they used this proposition scam once again to get it passed. In the very first year, that law, in the first year alone, California, that law stole $600 million from California smokers. Money that they had worked to earn. It's now in the trillions of dollars, decades later, across the country. 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union began its 3-year dissolution. That was a very strange thing to observe, people. 1989, August 25th, Voyager 2 flies by the planet Neptune, second to the last of the planets out there. 1990. Wow, I remember that time so well. 1990. Now this is based on what we now know. At the time, we did not know this, but on July 25th of 1990, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, what was happening was Saddam Hussein was lining up his army on the border with Kuwait. It looked like he was threatening Kuwait. We now know that the U.S. ambassador to Iraq told Saddam Hussein, quote, "We have no opinion on the Arab conflicts." Other things that were said in that document indicated that we're not going to do anything if you invade Kuwait. And so, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And immediately, George H.W. Bush launched holy hell against Saddam Hussein. Demonized him in the media as the most evil person ever, and frankly, he was incredibly evil. I'm no fan of Saddam Hussein. He was a vicious, vicious, murderous tyrant, right on par with Stalin. But he wasn't the only one. And so we begin in 1990. We have Operation Desert Shield to protect Saudi Arabia, and then we have Operation... they had silly names for these things back then. What was that? Desert Sword, I think, where we actually invade and take back Kuwait and push the elite Republican Guard of the Iraqis back into Iraq. Well, that's all well and good, but I remember that time. That's also when CNN came into its own as a propaganda bullhorn. When you look at CNN's reporting of the Reagan shooting, when Reagan was shot, it was very good. They didn't know what was going on, and they made it clear to you that they didn't know. It was very fair reporting. You could see the genuine, sincere concern in the reporters' eyes, the anchormen. By a decade later, when you had Gulf War, they were just a servant of a corrupt government, a servant of the deep state. You could just see it, the way they functioned. It was absolute lunacy. It was a sideshow, a circus. But Desert Storm was a success. It left Saddam in power, and because of the power of television, we got to watch all those smart bombs go down the chimneys, and George H.W. Bush called it a vindication of the U.S. military after its disaster in Vietnam. American military might is back. That's the way they portrayed it. Another thing happened in the background in 1991 most people don't know about. Just some guy you never heard of named Bill Cooper. He published a book called Behold a Pale Horse. I'll say more about him in a moment. 1991 was also the failed August coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, who was head of the Soviet Union at that time. The Soviet Union was falling apart. Gorbachev was trying to, at least ostensibly, trying to open up the Soviet Union and be a little more friendly, a little more free. Grain of salt there, but so he was the likable leader of the Soviet Union, you might say, if you trust him at all. 1991, they had a failed coup against him, but he was taken into custody, basically house arrest, much like the Tsar in the original Russian Revolution, when the Tsar's family was taken under arrest, and then of course they were all shot by the Bolsheviks, which are like the leftists in America today, basically the same thing. But in this case, the government did not kill Gorbachev. He ended up being released. But Gorbachev resigned in 1991 and handed the power for Russia over to Boris Yeltsin, and immediately all those other members of the Soviet Union who had been taken over, all those other countries, left the Soviet Union. They ran away as fast as they possibly could. Just like Americans today, if they could get away from this banana republic that has overthrown Donald Trump, we would run as fast as we can to get away from it. Because we are headed for what the Soviet Union had back then. And people just don't get it. Also in 1991, you remember all that stuff going on in Mena, Arkansas? You know? With all the drug running and those two kids being shot and killed, left on the train tracks, and all the skullduggery going on there. Well, there was an Arkansas State police officer who was investigating that. His name was Russell Welch. And as he did so, he was learning about a lot of corruption in the Arkansas state government, Arkansas, which was overseen by Bill Clinton, the governor. He was finding corruption at various levels in that government. He contracted inhaled military-grade anthrax. Someone sent him a letter, and when he opened it, it electrostatically put this anthrax powder in his face, and he contracted anthrax. It didn't kill him, but it weakened him and debilitated him permanently so that he could no longer work. It ended his investigation. The reason I mention that is because when the anthrax scare happened immediately after 9/11, we were told that the only time anthrax was ever used in a military sense of that grade was by the CIA. The only two instances of anthrax being used, at least publicly, the only two instances of anthrax being used in America as a weapon like that, after 9/11, to just raise terror in America, no other reason, and in 1991 to stop the police officer who was investigating a chain of command that would possibly, eventually lead up to the man who was about to be run for the President of the United States the following year. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But do some research. Don't draw conclusions just based on the dots I'm painting here. Because we don't know what the real truth is there. We don't know. It is possible that Bill Clinton was so busy, dancing with girls that he didn't even know what was going on in Mena. It's possible. I don't know. But again, how many coincidences can you have before it's no longer a coincidence? 1992. Ruby Ridge Massacre. The FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which should not exist, were serving a warrant on a man for failure to appear on firearms charges, which should not have existed, because the Second Amendment clearly says you shall pass no law restricting firearms ownership or carrying them. So in other words, the government was breaking the law left and right here in the first place, and they were blaming the poor guy who was just doing what the Constitution said he had every right to do. So These guys were holed up. They lived in a cabin out in the middle of nowhere. They didn't like the government, and they just wanted to be left alone. The man and his family, Randy Weaver. Well, all these ATF and FBI people surrounded their cabin. The kid, 14-year-old son Sammy, he didn't know who they were. You've got all these people out there. I mean, it looked like who knows what was going on. They were coming to attack his family. He started shooting, and the government killed the 14-year-old son Sammy. And there turned into a many-day standoff there. A sniper named Lon Horiuchi eventually ended up shooting Randy Weaver's wife dead. She was not armed. She was only armed with a baby. She was holding her baby in her arms. But he shot her in the head, and she and the baby fell to the ground. Lon Horiuchi would end up being a sniper in Waco less than a year later at the Waco siege. He didn't get punished. Yeah, and in case you didn't know, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they do have snipers. You know, just like Sherlock Holmes would have a sniper, right? Makes perfect sense, right? Lon Horiuchi was never punished. They did try to indict him, but you see, back in the 50s, if Lon Horiuchi had done that, he would have been punished properly. In the 1990s, something different happened, and that's the change that's happened in America. In fact, no government employee was punished for the massacre at Ruby Ridge, massacre of a family. Don't forget, Lon Horiuchi's job, his job, by definition, as a sniper of a domestic Federal Bureau of Investigation, his job is to shoot American citizens. His job isn't to shoot somebody in Afghanistan or Australia. His job is to shoot a gun at American citizens. That's a problem, folks. And people were trying to raise the alarm about that in 1990s, and nobody listened. In the 92 election, Ross Perot came out of nowhere as a third party, and he really upset everything. He actually got a lot of votes, but the thing is, it didn't matter who won, did it? It was either going to be George Bush or Bill Clinton, and you might want to rewind about a half hour and listen to what I said there to see why it didn't matter which one of those two won. On January of 1993, Bill Clinton was sworn in as President of the United States, a guy who nobody had even heard of a year earlier. It's almost as if he knew something other people didn't know, which would get him into that crowd. In 1993, and I remember this well, cellular phones started to become readily available. It was the first time I saw people carrying a phone that they could talk on right there. It didn't have that big, huge antenna. It looked like some kind of a military phone. It was just a little phone in your hand. 1993. That turned out to be an absolute disaster for us. 1993 also, the news media began stirring up Americans with a terrifying scare about Y2K. They're claiming that when the year 2000 comes, the computers don't know how to roll over the date, and everything's going to collapse. Nuclear power plants are going to explode, planes will fall from the sky, locusts, asteroids. Sounds a lot like what the anti-smokers said, really, to be honest. But the news media were the ones stirring up that scare, and a lot of business people who have no idea what they're doing spent a lot of their investors' money fixing a problem that really just didn't exist. There was an issue there. There was a computer issue there, but that was the definition of a scare. Remember all those books I told you about earlier, going back 100 years, about propaganda and how to manipulate masses of people, especially through fear and terror? Are all these things starting to tie together for you now? 1993, another absolute disaster happened. 93 was one of the worst years in American history. It was the beginning of the privatization of the student loan industry. It was the conversion of the U.S. Department of Education, which was already absolutely worthless and damaging, the conversion of that into nothing more than a collection agent for private companies. A collection agent that wields the power of the U.S. government. Imagine if Al Capone could command the U.S. military. That's the kind of thing you're looking at there. That began in 1993. It was also, for that reason, it was essentially the institutionalization of education as nothing more than a business. Nothing to do with education, just a business. And for that reason, it basically started the process of rendering a college education all but useless. I mean, not to say if you want to be a doctor, you have to go to medical school, of course, but the idea of a college education taking you to another level just because you have the education, that was gone. It was all about money, and it still is. And remember, I mean, I don't think anybody really listened to my existential threat was one of my existential threats was the student loan racketeering industry. And if you listen in there, you'll find that the U.S. Department of Education has its own heavily armed quasi-military. They can go bust down people's doors if you default on student loans. They can go kick in your door with guns ablazing or guns pointed at your kids' heads. They can shoot the dog like they did in Waco. Or didn't you know that? Maybe you should have watched my videos. It's been sitting there for a year. 1993, January 4th. Something happened that few people know about. January 4th, that Bill Cooper, who published that book called Behold a Pale Horse, he began broadcasting a shortwave show called The Hour of the Time. Now, I'm not sitting here saying I'm a big fan of Bill Cooper. I'm certainly not a big, faithful follower or anything, but I have a lot of respect for his impact in the 90s. God willing, I'll be able to do a tribute to show you what he did. 93. We're only up to March, folks. We're only up to March of 93. 93 was a bad, bad year for the United States of America. In March, there was a shootout when those same ATF and FBI agents who had slaughtered the Weaver family in Idaho, they came down to Waco, Texas, and instead of just waiting for David Koresh to go out jogging as he always did, or to go to his regular table at his regular diner as he always did, instead of doing that, they decided to bring in the whole military and just surround the place, shoot the dog, and start a big fight to serve a warrant on David Koresh. They could have done it the easy way, just waited for him every single week. He went to the same diner, went jogging at the same time, like clockwork. They could have just grabbed him, but they didn't do that. They wanted to do something that would put on a big show on television to try to redeem themselves after slaughtering the Weaver family, and instead they dug themselves another hole because they're utterly incompetent, because they shouldn't be doing what they're doing in the first place. One of the snipers there at Waco was Lon Horiuchi, the guy who shot Randy Weaver's wife while she was armed with nothing more than a baby. So that siege began in March of 1993. On April 19th, the government went in with their tanks. They inserted CS gas, which, among other things, will cause your limbs to snap in the opposite direction of the way that the muscles work. It's the same gas that when you add, I think you just add water, was used in the Holocaust to kill people. And they inserted it into that house that was filled with 76 men, women, and children. And of course it caught fire, and in front of the whole world, those people were massacred. Attorney General Janet Reno said the buck stops here, and yet she was never punished. In fact, no government employee was ever punished. Many of them were promoted instead. A lowly, just sniveling weasel in the House of Representatives became the poster boy for covering this up to protect the Clintons. His name was Representative Chuck Schumer. And as you can see, he has been rewarded handsomely for his role in the cover-up of the Waco massacre. 1993, a short while later in July, Deputy Counsel there at the White House, Vince Foster, commits suicide. On him was a letter that said, "I was not meant for the job or the spotlight of public life in Washington. Here, ruining people is considered sport." Does that sound like anything you've seen going on in Washington lately? Here, ruining people is considered sport. A lot of conspiracy theories came out there, but I believe he killed himself. I just think we'll never know exactly the reason why. 93 is really the beginning, more or less, of the public World Wide Web. Using hypertext, the ability to click and link around instead of having to use a keyboard and text on the internet. It didn't really take off until 94, 95, 96, something like that. But most people would say 93 is when the web began. 1994, Surgeon General Joycelyn Elders suggested that the government should teach young people how to masturbate. That's the purpose of government, according to these people, folks. 1994, the same time, the GOP platform for the red wave that took the houses, both houses of Congress, remember Newt Gingrich and all that? The platform for that included verbiage that said the federal government has no constitutional authority to be involved in school curricula or to control jobs in the marketplace. This is why we will abolish the Department of Education, end federal meddling in our schools, and promote family choice at all levels of learning. Unquote. They were not able to get that passed, much to our detriment. They tried to get rid of the Department of Education, this vicious, militarized mockery of what education is. But they didn't do it. 1995. 2 years after Waco, to the day, April 19th, the Oklahoma City bombing. I remember that one well. Lots of skullduggery around that one. 1995 also, JFK Jr. JFK Jr. is the little child who saluted his father's coffin back in 1963. JFK Jr. was then probably in his 30s. He was a lawyer in his own right. He founded a political magazine called George. 1996, April 3rd, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Ron Brown is killed in a plane crash in Croatia. 1996, a few months later, July 17th, TWA Flight 800 goes down shortly after takeoff. An executive order from Bill Clinton shortly thereafter. 1997, March 11th, Executive Order 13039 removed whistleblower protections for Navy personnel who took part in the salvage operation of TWA 800. In other words, with all the whistleblower protections for federal employees, Bill Clinton made it so that only that one group of Navy who could see the wreckage of Flight 800 were not protected if they told what they saw. I suggest you look online for Executive Order 13039. You'll see a lot of abstracts of it, but you're not going to find the text for it, are you? 1996, the Taliban take over Afghanistan. They immediately begin harboring terrorists like Osama bin Laden, and they immediately begin to destroy ancient, irreplaceable statues as the world just sits back and does nothing about it. Can you imagine if they took over Egypt and they destroyed the pyramids? That's what the Taliban did over there in Afghanistan, and nobody did anything about it. They just sat back and watched. Because if all you're concerned about is money and power, you don't really care about irreplaceable ancient relics being destroyed. 1997, the California state smoking ban. And you know, as they say, what happens in California spreads to the rest of the world. Just like disease does. 1997, CNN's Peter Arnett interviews Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, even as the CIA, the greatest intelligence apparatus on the face of the earth, the greatest military, says they can't find Osama bin Laden. And CNN's Peter Arnett goes over there and interviews him. 1 year later, ABC's John Miller interviews Osama bin Laden, even as the most powerful military-industrial complex with the greatest intelligence service in the world claims it can't find Osama bin Laden. CNN, ABC. You starting to see a pattern, folks? 1998 as well. Minnesotans elect Jesse Ventura as the governor of Minnesota. Yeah. 1999. Radio Shack, remember, founded in 1921? Radio Shack reaches its peak as a company and starts its rapid decline. That is significant, folks. Radio Shack is something that served American citizens who taught themselves science and physics. That's the way I see it. Taught themselves. Not told by the government, not taught junk science, but they went out and they learned the real thing by experimenting themselves. They were the innovators. Radio Shack began its decline, 1999. Also in 1999, July 16th, JFK Jr. is killed in a small plane crash, the plane he's piloting, along with his wife and his sister-in-law, 38 years old. Some people thought he might run for president. Do you believe in coincidences that much, folks? 1999, Columbine school shooting massacre happens, starting a long string of ridiculous school shootings that never should happen. Has nothing to do with guns, has everything to do with culture. 1990s, the guns have been around since 1776. You didn't hear about kids going out and shooting up taverns, legislatures. You didn't hear anything of the kind over the last 250 years. But all of a sudden it starts, and they blame the guns. Sorry, folks, something else going on there. I'll let you figure out what it is. 1990s, MP3s and digital music became available. Changed the whole way that the music industry functions. Remember, the music industry had taken over music with disco and turned music into garbage. Now, the people could take it back, and the music industry fought really hard. Around the year 2000 with Napster, the music industry started suing everybody with these John Doe lawsuits. They were suing grandmothers. They were suing pets. They were suing people who had died. They were suing everything they possibly could, just in an effort to try and stop people from taking control over music again. Then in the year 2000, when the year 2000 finally came around, the Y2K meltdown never happened, did it? Nothing. Nothing. As anyone who understands computers should have expected. However, despite that, one person went berserk on New Year's Eve of 2000 and started telling everyone that everything was melting down. Nuclear power plants are shutting down. The Russians are launching nuclear missiles at us. There's tanks rolling in the streets of Austin, Texas, scaring the crap out of everybody. This guy's name was Alex Jones. Remember that guy I told you about who started the broadcast called Hour of the Time, Bill Cooper? About a week later, Bill Cooper exposed him, Alex Jones. Pay attention to those two gentlemen. Alex Jones was just lying through his teeth, scaring the crap out of everybody, and he's still around. Bill Cooper is dead. Bill Cooper was exposing Alex Jones. Think about that. We'll get to it in a bit. The 2000 election, which was disputed heavily because of hanging chads in Florida. You know, the people there weren't smart enough to figure out how to punch a hole in a piece of paper. Actually, that was used as justification for why we need to have electronic voting machines. That was the year 2000, folks. Do you see a pattern here yet? The Supreme Court ended up giving that to Bush, and Al Gore went on to become the greatest scientist in American history, talking about climate change, even though he doesn't know anything whatsoever about science. The year 2000, August 15th, the witnesses who saw missiles being shot at TWA Flight 800 before it exploded and fell to the ground put an ad in the Washington Times to tell the people that they saw a missile hitting TWA 800 and exploding, and that they had been threatened by the FBI and they were sick of it. Nobody cared. The year 2001, George W. Bush takes office, and he is an absolute definition of a do-nothing president for 9 months. The guy was on vacation his first 9 months, golfing, partying. Even at the time, I was just thinking day by day, when is this guy going to do anything? This guy's asleep. All right. In June of 2001, a few months after George W. Bush takes office, Bill Cooper on his Hour of the Time broadcast predicts that a 9/11 type event will happen, possibly to the World Trade Center, and it will be blamed on Osama bin Laden. That was in June of 2001. In the same month, June of 2001, Timothy McVeigh is executed for the Oklahoma City bombing. September 11, 2001, the 9/11 attacks. Obviously, I remember it. Everybody who was alive at the time remembered it. Within minutes of the attacks, when it became obvious that it was an attack and not an accident with the first plane, the media was blaming Osama bin Laden. Hey, isn't that what in June Bill Cooper said? He predicts a 9/11 type event, a massive terrorist attack on U.S. soil, probably at the World Trade Center, to be blamed on bin Laden. Hey, what do you know? That's exactly what happened. The media had no idea what had happened. They didn't even know. They didn't know. They couldn't tell you anything that was going on. It was just, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, except for one thing. Bin Laden did it. Meanwhile, bin Laden puts out a press release saying, I had nothing to do with it. I'd love to go into I'd love to go into September 11th with you folks, but I'm just not going to do it. Moving right along then, shortly after 9/11 was the anthrax attacks. Anthrax sent to, the House Majority Leader and some members of the media. The only other time that had ever been done was with that Arkansas police investigator who was researching what was going on, shall we say, very close to the governor of Arkansas, who very shortly thereafter would announce his candidacy for president. Very shortly thereafter, the Patriot Act is all ready to go, somehow, some way. Remember, George Bush didn't do anything for 9 months. He's just out partying. He's just driving around having a good old time. I can't remember anything he did his first 9 months in office. As soon as 9/11 happens, all of a sudden this guy has this, how many pages was it? 2,000 pages? This Patriot Act's just there already written. All ready for the occasion for some reason. Taking away American freedoms, putting us under surveillance, doing some really nasty things, and it's just ready. It's like they just pulled it out of the closet after 9/11. It was all set to go. And because people don't think, and we have such irresponsible legislators, they pass the thing without thinking, without researching, without learning. Does that sound familiar for anything that has happened recently? Shortly after that, November 5th, Bill Cooper, remember? The guy who predicted 9/11? Oh, and by the way, back after the Oklahoma City bombing, where Bill Cooper was instrumental in getting the word out about what was going on there, there was a memo from the White House that said that Bill Clinton called Bill Cooper the most dangerous radio host in America. So after 9/11, after the anthrax attacks, after the Patriot Act was passed, on November 5th, Bill Cooper was shot dead by the government outside his own front door. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not implying a conspiracy there. Okay? Unfortunately, Bill Cooper was more responsible than anybody for him being shot that day. Okay? I am not saying the government went out there and assassinated him, but it's part of a bigger issue with the government not wanting Bill Cooper around. All right? He could have avoided being killed on that day if he had followed the rules. Anyway, we'll talk more about him later. But again, how many coincidences before it's no longer a coincidence? Bill Cooper died shortly after completing episode number 1926 of his Hour of the Time broadcast, which was through the 90s probably the only broadcast in the United States of America that even attempted to focus like a laser beam on the truth. I'm not saying he did it all the time. Like I said, I'm not a sycophant of Bill Cooper, but the man tried. 2002. As a result of the 9/11 attacks, without investigating anything, without learning anything, without thinking, we just go to war. We invade Afghanistan, and then we end up invading Iraq, who had nothing to do with 9/11. The reasons for going there were totally vaguely defined. George Bush is just saying things like, we're fighting evil, and we're still tied up over there. 2003. February 1st, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrates on entry, and what do you know? It's not an engineering problem. Once again, it's a managerial problem. It was a political problem. It was stupid people running the show that killed yet another 7 astronauts. That's 14 astronauts killed by the shuttle program alone, not by engineering, but by stupid people being in charge. Does that sound anything like what's going on at the U.S. Capitol today, people? Do you see the pattern yet? 2003, October 7th, Arnold Schwarzenegger is elected governor of California. Now, I want to point out one thing here because it's relevant not only to his election but also Jesse Ventura in Minnesota. I was in California at the time. I lived there at the time. And I remember asking one woman who I worked with, just your normal middle class woman, she voted for Schwarzenegger, and I said, "Why did you vote for Schwarzenegger?" And she said, "Oh, his wife is so pretty, Sharon." I was like, "Sharon?" "Yeah, Sharon Stone, the actress, she's so pretty." I said, "Let me get this straight. You voted for Schwarzenegger because you think his wife is pretty?" "Well, yeah, she's awesome. It made a great first lady." And I was like, "You realize that's not his wife, right? She only played his wife in a movie, Total Recall." And do you see the pattern, folks? Do you see the pattern here? When people don't think and they don't learn and they don't pay any attention whatsoever to what's going on in the world that they live in, but then they take action. The year 2006, NASA launches the New Horizons probe to the planet Pluto. Also in the year 2006, scientists, in quotation marks, redefine what a planet is, and all of a sudden Pluto is no longer even a planet. Why is that significant? Listen to my junk science videos and you'll find out. That might seem benign. That was them trying to save themselves from being caught. The year 2008, the mortgage crisis. Remember that? Worst financial crisis since the Great Depression? Remember that? If you listen to my video about student loan racketeering, you'll find out how the stimulus checks, the main winner of those stimulus checks, they were supposed to go to individual taxpayers, but the single entity that got most of that, about $20 billion, or we can't tell the exact numbers, $10, $20 billion, somewhere in that range, was Sallie Mae, the student loan servicer who was able to intercept the 1 million defaulted student loan debtors' stimulus checks. And Sallie Mae had helped to pay for George Bush's inaugural ball. Do you see a pattern here, folks? Do you see a pattern? Maybe you might want to listen to that video about student loan racketeering. I posted it, I believe, more than a year ago. 2011, the space shuttle program officially ends. Well, they only lost 2 of them. Hey, I guess at NASA they consider that a success. They only lost 2 vehicles and 14 astronauts. Year 2011, in May, Osama bin Laden is supposedly killed by the United States. No evidence of his death is presented, and among the papers that are supposedly found in bin Laden's possession was an undated letter to the American people where bin Laden urged the American people to support Barack Obama's efforts against climate change. Meanwhile, units that were associated with those who took part in that raid were shot down and killed a few months later by the Taliban. Something happened in between, though, that's kind of significant. Vice President Joe Biden publicly identified the unit that had killed Osama bin Laden. Before that helicopter carrying those people was shot down. And Vice President Joe Biden, he publicly identified that classified information. Just in case you didn't know that. Also in 2011, WikiLeaks tells the whole world, that's where we learned about April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, basically telling Saddam Hussein, we're not going to do anything at all if you invade Kuwait. Of course, after he invaded Kuwait, we unleashed hell on him, didn't we? WikiLeaks is the only reason we know about that. Look at what they're doing to the people behind WikiLeaks. They sure want to stop them. Do you see a pattern, folks? They sure want to censor them and silence them. Do you see a pattern? The year 2012, August 25th, Voyager 1, launched in 1977? Voyager 1 becomes the first spacecraft to pass the heliopause and leave the solar system. Wow, amazing. 2015, Radio Shack files for bankruptcy. Founded in 1921, Radio Shack was the main supporter for Americans who use their brains in terms of toying with electronics and technology and such. And it files for bankruptcy. There's a metaphor there you can't miss. The year 2015, New Horizons probe finally arrives at Pluto. I'm surprised Pluto even greeted the spacecraft since it had been demoted from a planet, but that is an amazing technological achievement. 1 year later, 2016, Donald Trump is elected President of the United States. In January 2017, he is sworn in as the 45th President of the United States. In his presidency, he brings peace to the Middle East. He leaves the Paris Climate Change Accord, which is junk science. He ends the Iran agreement that gave Iran all kinds of free money and allowed them to build a nuclear weapon. He told NATO that either they're going to pay their fair share or we're going to leave. He brokered peace agreements between Israel and formerly hostile neighbors. He built a wall to protect Americans from who knows what that could be coming in carrying who knows what weapon. And yet, throughout all that time, for 4 years, the leftists, the news media that was not the same news media that reported on Reagan's shooting back in 1980, this was a totally different news media. All they did for 4 years was attack Trump every day. They behaved with the rabid hatred. It was like Captain Ahab going after Moby Dick. They're just absolutely obsessed by any standard exhibiting mental illness throughout the whole period. By any reasonable standard. No normal, stable person is that obsessed and focused on destroying one other person for 4 years straight. Doesn't happen. By the year 2020, the United States of America was thriving like never before. The Middle East was enjoying peace like it hasn't before. And then all of a sudden, coronavirus. The coronavirus health scare, which was pushed by the same media that was attacking Donald Trump, that had promoted the Gulf War as being justified, that had basically been a lapdog of the deep state for the last 30 years. The media even put up body count counters. Every day you could go and see the body count, the little counter they had, scaring the crap out of everybody to make sure that people obeyed instead of taking charge of their own life and their own health. And in that sense, the coronavirus health scare followed the anti-smoking playbook that I've been describing here perfectly. It just did it in a very accelerated fashion. The supposed health issue of coronavirus was immediately politicized by the left. All politics. They couldn't care less who lives or who dies. It's what can I get out of it politically. Democrat governors immediately called for mail-in voting in the presidential elections, which wasn't coming for months later for some inexplicable reason. Why was that? George Floyd dies in police custody in Minnesota. Of course, he was already bordering death already because he was overdosing on drugs, but that's beside the point. Protests broke out, they turned into riots, and the leaders of Minnesota, particularly Governor Tim Walz, did absolutely nothing to stop it. And by doing so, he set the precedent for the rest of the nation, and as those riots spread across the country, they did nothing to stop it, following the precedent set by Governor Tim Walz. And if you don't know how many riots actually happened in the states, if you think it just happened in Minnesota and then Portland and Washington, you might want to look at a map and see what really happened. Meanwhile, Antifa and Black Lives Matter become prominent agitators in the news media. At the beginning of this, I told you back in the 1700s what was going on. Incredibly smart, well-meaning, good people starting this country, and here's how we end it with Antifa. Just a bunch of pathetic losers, no brain cells working, Black Lives Matter, completely manipulated by the very people who can't stand blacks. Just boggles the human mind. This is how we end this nation. Democrats nominate Joe Biden as their candidate and once again steal the nomination from Bernie Sanders. Biden doesn't even bother to run a campaign for some reason. Hardly ever even leaves his basement, hardly ever goes outside. When he does, he has five or six people there watching him, sitting in chairs 6 feet apart. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, every one of his rallies, tens of thousands of people. And yet somehow on election night, Trump is winning big all day and into the evening, just as you would expect, just as every indicator said would happen. And then all of a sudden the vote counting stopped in 6 important states. And then a few hours later, when the vote counting resumed, all of a sudden all the votes are going to Joe Biden. And the media declares Joe Biden the winner of the election. And big tech immediately begins to censor or delete anybody who even talks about problems with the election. On January 6, 2021, many members of Congress contested the election. That forced a public debate. But before that debate could begin, once again, do you believe in coincidences, folks? Once again, right at that moment, a riot breaks out at the U.S. Capitol. And when Congress reconvenes after that riot, those same members of Congress who had moments before said, I'm challenging this to protect the integrity of our electoral system, they now suddenly said, I'm not going to do anything anymore because of what happened outside. I'm not going to protect our electoral system anymore. And Joe Biden is confirmed by Congress as the president-elect. And with that, the United States of America came to an end. What we have today is Joe Biden as the first president of the Banana Republic of America. But before I end this, I want to just talk about one last event in American history. It happened on December 30th, 2020, right before the end of the new year. Do you remember back when I was talking about 1964 and I talked about the premiere of Gilligan's Island? Do you remember how I said that of those 7 castaways, the one who got the most fan mail was Dawn Wells, who played Mary Ann? That was 1964. On December 30 of 2020, Dawn Wells died at the age of 82 years old. This is someone who, when I was growing up, was so cute. I loved her. She was adorable to me and to so many others. She was sweet and wholesome and innocent, at least the character on Gilligan's Island. Gilligan's Island was nothing but good fun. It made your life better to watch it. It was just good slapstick humor. It brought nothing but goodness to our lives since 1964. When she passed away on December 30 of 2020, what did the people in charge do? They claimed that she died because of COVID-19. They politicized the death of Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island. And I don't know any way to try to get across to people out there just how sick and deranged these people really are. Thank you for watching, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't include even more events in American history, but hopefully this timeline in order, hopefully with minimal commentary, but I know I broke that rule from time to time, but I sure hope it'll help you understand a little better what has happened to this country. We started out really well. We survived some incredibly difficult challenges. This country truly was great. It really was. And our generation gave it away and voluntarily chose to live in a totalitarian society. Thanks for listening.